Okay, we're going to get started. So I want to thank all of you for joining us here. This is really nice to see so many of you here. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. This is another program in collaboration with the Manchester Historical Society, and we're just thrilled to partner with them on a nice series of programs throughout the year. We're thrilled to have Shawn and Bill and Bob with us today. Let me tell you a little bit about Shawn. He serves as curator of the Manchester Historical Society, and he has, over the past 8 years, been digitizing thousands of pieces for their collection to use for outreach, education at local schools, as well as in print and social media. Bill Badger is a founding member and current membership chair of the Rutland Railroad Historical Society, and he has been a dedicated board member of the Manchester Historical Society for several decades. I'm going to let Shawn have the honor of introducing Bob Waibel. So I want to thank you, the three of you, for being with us here today.
Thanks, Gloria. All of us are glad to be here, and especially thank you, Gloria, and thank you, Liz, for hosting us and setting everything up. Yeah, I'm Shawn Harrington. I'm the curator of the Historical Society, and tonight we're in for a real treat. And we were kind of joking beforehand, we are probably going to go over what the usual expected time is, just because there's so much information, and we're going to leave out more than is in, but we hope that what you walk away with is a greater appreciation and understanding, and certainly with questions, and that you'll reach out to the Historical Society and we'll follow up. And Bob's here tonight, which is wonderful. Bob moved to Manchester when he was 14 in 1967, and has probably spent more hours of the summer and winter up on East Mountain and Liebrook Wilderness, tromping along the old Rich Lumber railroad lines, and has made the trips out to Wanakena. And every time I've spoken about Rich Lumber on our Facebook group page, he always chimes in about Wanakena in Pennsylvania. So I said, well, when we go to the Rich, we want you to come and lead us off. And it's great to know about Rich here in Manchester, but it's nice to know where they came from, because there's a lot of family ties that came, from Wanakena to here. So with that, I am going to share my screen. All right. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob, because we are going to start in Wanakena. Well, he's going to say a little something about Pennsylvania, but I'm going to shut up. It's all yours, Bob.
Well, welcome. I'm very glad to be here tonight. Yeah, I'm a person who has a bit of an obsession with Rich Lumber Company. I'm not a railroad expert like Bill, but I have studied their history quite a lot and spent a lot of time researching and tromping around where they used to be. But so we're going to start off with Wanakena. Herbert Rich was the lead man, the dominant partner, I should say, of the company for its entire 34-year history. Rich Lumber Company spanned from 2 jobs in Pennsylvania was their first, onto the Adirondacks, and then on to Manchester. As a young man, Herbert started out in the hardware business. He had a hardware store in his hometown of Cattaraugus, New York. Cattaraugus is out in western New York, just above about Central Point, above the Pennsylvania state line. He actually ended up having 2 hardware stores, one in his hometown and another one, and he ran those for a few years. Somewhere along the line, he thought it would be a lucrative thing to get into the lumbering business. He didn't know really anything about it, but there was a lot of people getting into it in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He discussed it with his first cousin, Horace, and together they decided to start a lumber company, and they named it Rich Lumber Company, and they started it in 1885. We started off with a kind of a smaller job in the hills of Pennsylvania, in a town of Gardoux, and when that was exhausted, they moved on to a little bigger project, kind of like Wanakena. They actually had to build a town out of the wilderness. There was nothing there. They named the town Garner, and I don't know the origin of that name, but it's the name he chose. But that went along. They started their career like they ended it. They had a couple mill fires early on, and they ended up being able to harvest all the timber and exhaust that by 1901. So in 1901, they started searching for their next big adventure, and they found a plot of land that they really thought would be great. It had good sized timber on it. The mill diet would change when they moved to Wanakena, to that area. They had been pretty much sawing all hemlock hardwood in Pennsylvania jobs, but here it was going to be spruce and white pine mostly, and kind of like that when they got to Manchester. The area where they purchased 16,000 acres, and the area they purchased was on the southwestern shore of Cranberry Lake. Cranberry Lake is one of the third largest lakes in the Adirondack Park. And their other border was on what's called the Oswegatchie River to the north of the land. And Oswegatchie in later years became a really famous trout stream. You might wonder where the name Wanakena came from. And that, in historical legend, is said that he was traveling around and he was out in Buffalo, New York, and he saw the name Wanakena on a Pullman rail car. Pullman cars notoriously were named. You know, we have one at Hilding, it's called Sunbeam. They all had names. He saw that name, liked it, for some reason remembered it, and he said, I'm going to name my town. So he purchased 16,000 acres for $500,000, which was quite a bit of money at the time. When you put it into perspective of today, that same amount of money is worth about $14.5 million. And he did have 5 other investors. There were people that had shares, but he had been pretty successful so far. And this Wanakena was the largest undertaking in the entire company history. The first thing they had to figure out is, how are they going to build this town? The nearest railroad was 6 miles away, and the New York Central, they actually called it the Carthage and Adirondack Railway, run by the New York Central, came into a little town called Benson Mines. And Benson Mines is a huge iron ore mine. It was there for 100 years and closed up actually in the late 70s. But they had a railroad depot there and stores and different things. So they laid track from Benson Mines into what was going to be the center of Wanakena. They had to get their locomotives, obviously, all their equipment in there and all their various things. So, first thing they did is they set up a steam donkey engine in the middle of what was going to be the town center. And steam donkey has the motor, but it also operated a big winch with hundreds of feet of cable on it. And along with them came, in Pennsylvania, they had mostly Swedish lumberjacks that worked in the log jobs. So they came along with them, and they chopped the trees down, and they used the steam donkey motor to pull, not only pull logs, but they also uprooted stumps to clear the whole area. You can go to the next slide, Sean. This is a picture, one of the few I could find with Herbert Rich in it over the years, but Herbert Rich is the gentleman on the right-hand side. In the middle, there's a gentleman named Otto Hamley. He was actually a millwright. He worked for Rich, but he also worked in the Ford Brothers mill. Millwrights kind of take care of all the mechanical aspects of the mills. The gentleman on the left was named Dick Hanley. His title was Woods Boss, and he was kind of a liaison between the remote lumber camps and Rich Lumber, the lumber camps where they actually had to bid on a tract of land that they were going to harvest. And if they won the bid, then of course they had their camps out in the forest, and their job was to get the timber to the landing. And then Rich Lumber Company, they basically only owned the railroad, the employees, and they picked all the logs up from the landings and moved them into the mills. You can go to the next one, Sean. And so on that 6 mile length of railroad, he had other plans too down the road. In Wanakena, one of the first buildings they built was the company store, but the next building they built was a large hotel. And he was quite a businessman, and he saw opportunities in many ways, not just in the lumbering, but he had plans for this town to really be something. And so you can see there's a couple passenger coaches, and they had a couple flat cars, and they had box cars. And this engine here, early on, the first year they were there, he had brought 2 Shea geared locomotives with him to lumber for the lumber operations, and they used that to move on this line for a little while. But this engine here is a Lima rod engine produced by Lima Locomotive in Lima, Ohio, and this served from about 1908 It was at 03 or 04, they put it into service, and it served until a couple of years after they left Wanakena. But at its height, it's actually transported 18 to 20,000 people per year into Wanakena on this railroad. So, you know, they brought people in, they brought material in, but they also used this line to ship out all their finished products from the mills. This is just next one here. It shows the Lima engine back in with the two coaches. You can see all the people there getting off the train. There are boardwalks all throughout this town. The boardwalk, as it goes to the left, led up to the hotel. The building sort of center right back, you can see behind the people, that was the Rich and Andrews Company store. It was one of Herbert Rich's brothers who partnered with a man named Andrews for that. And the roof you see all over the locomotive, that was the train depot. Okay, Sean. This is with the Rich and Andrews store here. They had many, many products in it. It'll tell you here, just quickly reading here, the first floor of the store offered cookies, crackers, sugar, cereals, cheeses, butter, tea, coffee, drugs, fabrics, housewares, sporting goods, stationery, shoes from ladies' button-up to loggers' boots. The top floor displayed clothing and bedding, and the basement held barrels of staples such as salted meats, pickles, olives, and molasses. So pretty much everything a town could use in that store. Okay. This was the Rich's Hotel Wanakena. This picture here was about 1904, I think, and it actually, they doubled its size up in 1906. So it was quite successful. It was quite an undertaking, but like I said, it was, Rich had a lot of ideas here for financial gain. Okay. This picture is a shot of the veranda. You can sort of see people sitting down the other end. On that end there was a nice view over it. This sat up on a hill above town. It was a nice view across the Oswegatchie River, and you could actually see over to the mill complexes from there. Okay. And this was just a postcard advertising. In 1907, they doubled the size of the hotel, and it's just saying that the service will be much appreciated by our patrons. It was just an advertisement. Okay. This was a picture of, this is actually what they called 2nd Street here, running up in between those two boardwalks and some residences built behind it. This was within the first year or two the town was built. When they left Pennsylvania, they had about 45 residences plus the office and the mills and things like that. They just disassembled everything from that town. There's nothing there today but an old clearing and some railroad grades, including this church. And they brought it all on sections on the railroad cars. It was a couple hundred railroad cars, I guess, to move everything. Plus, they brought some hemlock along with them to start building because the mills weren't set up here yet, too. Next one, John. This is a picture of that same church I took in 2007. It's absolutely gorgeous. I've been in it a few times. It's on the National Historic Register. I don't know. It's every time I go there, I just have to stop and look at it. It's really quite beautiful. Okay. This is, I don't have a historic picture of this one, and I've dug around, but this was Rich's company office in town. Behind it was where the company store was. This is pretty much the only thing that's changed on this is that this is a private residence today, and to the left there they added on a porch on the back. Okay. This building here was opposite from where the office was. They called this the reading room. It was actually the library. They had a lounge in there, a parlor. You know, people could go in there, relax, read. There was games in there. The lower building over onto the right with the two windows, that was a 2-lane bowling alley. It was really important to the Riches that their company employees and their families enjoyed being there. In the wintertime, this was a desolate, remote area. It wasn't easy to get anywhere. There was no cars, roads, or anything. You could ride the train out to go somewhere, but that was it. So he wanted them to be happy. He didn't want them to go stir crazy in the winter or anything. So it was bowling. He had all kinds of other activities in town, sleigh rides for the kids. There was a little hill in behind where the hotel was, and they could slide down there. The kids would jump on these and take a straw ride on wagon, and you know, they sledded in town. So, and he did care about his employees. I might note also that Wanakena was a dry town. There was no liquor allowed there, with only one exception, with the Italian camps. They wouldn't stand for it. They had to have their beer. This is, believe it or not, Rich Lumber Company being on this lake, and it's a sizable lake, and it's a beautiful lake. They had a couple of boats. This was one of them. They called it the Motor Launch Wanakena. It was actually gas powered. There was a few other boats. There was a mail boat that ran around from the village of Cranberry Lakeway in the north. Those were all steam powered, but this was gas powered. And this was another opportunity Rich saw to make some money. You know, he could tour people around from the hotel, give them rides. You know, take them up to the village, and you know, just, you know, the businessman at work. This was a fun project. This boat here, this was actually a racing boat. This was a 1910 photograph, but a couple of years before that, there was enough people getting around the other side of the lake. They started to have an annual boat race, and these guys in Rich Lumber Company's engine shop built this 4-cylinder gas engine, 40 horsepower, and it claimed 40 miles an hour. So it's pretty cool. You know, it's just something you don't think of a lumber company owning. Okay. This is just, I don't know how well you can see this on your screens at home, but this just kind of shows a little bit of the layout of the town. What's interesting is you see the vertical lines going up. Those are 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Street. And they're still named the same thing today. They didn't have the imagination that they had with the name Wanakena. And then where the railroad track is, you see Front Street. There's actually a street there called Front Street today. That's the Oswegatchie River as it comes in and flows out to the lake way off to the right. There's 2 rail lines. There are 2 lower rail lines. There's one that goes off to that one that you see there that goes off to the right. That went down to an area called Dead Creek Flow. It was a 2.5-mile line. Out there was one of the French camps, and that's actually where Manchester historical member Tim's grandfather was born out there, out along that line there at one of the lumber camps. Off to the other side is the longer line that goes out to an area called the Plains. And this shows just some of the mills. This is not all the mills. There was a veneer mill. There was a veneer mill for making plywood. There was a shoelace mill. Those were wooden forms that they used to make the leather shoes over. There was a stave and heading mill that made barrel staves and barrel heads for wooden barrels. You know, products were shipped all over in wooden barrels in those days. You know, molasses, sugar, hardware, you name it. They also had a whip butt mill, and the whip butt mill, if you don't know what whip butts are, they were end handles for buggy whips they made there out of wood. They used some hardwood in there. There was some hardwood here, and they were used for a little bit of that stuff. And there was the main sawmill, but there was also, you know, chipping plants and for the paper products, you know, they would make chip for. But there was nothing that would come in from a tree that they couldn't use. They used every bit of the tree, even down to the sawdust. The sawdust was actually put through blowers, and it was blown into the boilers of all the steam engines that powered all these mills. Pretty fantastic operation. Okay. This was one of the 2 Shea locomotives they brought with them to Wanakena. They brought a number 4 and they brought number 2. They were both 50-ton variety. When they first started out, they bought a 50-ton and 2 35s. Then they added another 50-ton. When they came to Wanakena, they had disposed on the second job in Pennsylvania. They had disposed of the 2 35 tons, and the 50 tons are what they had decided worked best for them. That gentleman in the middle of the picture is Gene Madison. He was one of the most popular and well-known engineers they had on the Shays. Okay. This next picture is not a great picture. This is a picture of number 6. Bill has better pictures of this in his Manchester presentation, but number 6 was, they owned 7. They had 7 numbered locomotives in their lifetime, but they only really owned 6. Number 6 had been number 2 previously, but it had a horrible accident. The front of the boiler blew out of it. And yeah, you can see in this picture, if you look below the light, these guys are all posed for a picture probably after the fact, a day or so after, but you can see the front of the boiler was blown out. and it was pushing a load of log cars out to pick up at the landings about a mile from town. You can see on the lower trucks on this first car here were blown right off the tracks with the impact. Unfortunately, there was a jewelry salesman riding on that first car. You know, traveling salesmen were popular in those days. They traveled these small towns with their cases to sell their wares. He was going out to the lumber camps, he was a jewelry salesman, probably to see some of the women at the cook camps or some of the wives that happened to be out there. And when that exploded, it took him and his life and his jewelry case and everything with it. Go to the next one, Shawn. This is just a picture of the back of the cab of the train. 3 of Rich's employees were injured there, obviously the engineer and probably the fireman and whoever else was in there. But yeah, it was a sad day. But when they rebuilt it, it became number 6 and it finished out its life there and all through the history of Manchester as well. Okay. This is a Barnhart log loader. They use this extensively in Wanakena. Wanakena had virtually no vertical rise anywhere in their rail line. This railroad pretty much ran flat in all the 16 miles. There was only one area to the north, one section of tracks that there were some hills in. But Barnhart loader would actually, they put rails on top of all the cars, and this Barnhart loader could travel along car to car to car, and it would start on one end, and it would obviously on this end it started on the other end, and it would position itself on the next to the last car. It would load the last car, then it would move to the third car, load the second, and so on until it was at the end. It was on the last log car. In this case, it's in front of the engine. And when it got to that point, then it was time to just push the load into the sawmill complex and unload. Okay. This is a great photo. It's really neat. These guys, obviously, they posed for the photograph, but you can see this is on the next to the last car. They're loading the last car. And you can see the empty cars behind it. And I believe that's number 6 way at the end. They're waiting as they load at the landing. Okay. This is just another great, this is an area at the end of their longer line. It's an area called the Plains. And they use this as a log landing area. And they're loading here. You can see the Barnhart is going in the opposite direction here. It's loading away from the engine. So when it's done, it'll be on the last car as it's pulled into town. Okay. This map is tough, but it's just showing the rail lines. This long line, this line here down at the bottom. This is the longest leg. It's almost 10 miles long. Goes down in the area of High Falls, Plains, and there's boiling springs down there. The center, say you got the town up here. The center section there shows that around Cathedral Rock, there's a line. This line going off to the left, that's Cranberry Lake Railroad. That's the one that goes back to Benson Mines. That's their common carrier line. You know, and as the New York Central goes on up north. I love this picture. Somebody took pains to label it years ago. This is one of the lumber camps, and it shows on the left there, you see it's labeled a stable where all the horses stayed. The horses were extremely important, and they're very well taken care of. They had better lives than the loggers did. The camps on the right, there's 2. The farthest one is the men's camp, and the one behind it is the cook camp. On the right-hand side, there's one marked outside cellar, or you might call it a root cellar. In the foreground, you see a snowplow with a couple of horses attached to it. And in front of them, there's another log sleigh. In the middle, there's a sprinkler. They moved, the biggest share of their timber was moved in the wintertime. It was just easier for them to move in the winter than in the summertime. And what the practice was, there's not one shown in this picture, but what they did is when the snow started to come, they would pull, with the team of horses, they would pull a roller, and they would compact the snow down. And then they would have men would go in with shovels, and was there any low spots, they would fill in, and then they would pack it again. And then once they were satisfied it was packed pretty well, then they brought the sprinkler out. And the sprinkler was on, you know, like a sleigh too, full of water, and they would sprinkle the roads, and they would keep doing that, and they would build the road up till it was a good thick layer of ice. Then it made a low friction area for them to pull the log sleds with the horses. They carried tremendous loads. there wasn't enough time today, but I've got some great pictures of massive loads on some of these log sleighs. And the horses all had cork shoes, you know, so spikes on the shoes, so they had traction to pull them along. This is a really neat picture. You don't see this that often in the lumber camps, but this is a kind of staged, of course. There's a lady on the right with an apron on. She obviously is one of the cooks. But on the roof, that's actually cedar bark. In the springtime of the year, you can peel cedar bark pretty easily when the sap is flowing. So what they would do, they would slit the bark, and then they would take chisels and they'd go right around the trees and peel the bark off. And then they would stack, they'd be like 3-4 foot long sections. They would stack them one on top of the other, and they would wet them down with water. Then they would place weights on top of it and let it dry. And when it dried, it was flat. So they could use it for roofing. And if you go over the Adirondacks today, some of the great Adirondack camps that were built 100 or more years ago, there's still some of them that have cedar siding on them. So that it lasted many, many years. It's pretty cool. You don't see it that often in lumber camps. This is another staged bunch of guys working there, and shows some of their children that obviously were born at camp. That looks like a stable in the background by the size of the windows. I'm not positive on that, but kind of a tar paper roof on that. It wasn't such a fancy roof. The gentleman on the right-hand side there, he's a preacher. And preachers, there were several preachers that actually would ride the log cars out there at different times. They would go to the various camps, and if somebody wanted to have a sermon, he was willing to give it to them. So, okay. This picture I just love. I mean, you know, I think about, when I look at pictures like this, I think about how we think maybe we work hard, and you know, here are these guys, you know, working for pennies a day in some pretty horrible conditions, really hard work, long hours in the day, and they're out there with snow on the ground, and they're doing their wash in their wool pants, and you know, it's just I just admire this. You know, those guys were tough. You know, these immigrants wanted to work hard. That's just a little warming shack in the background. It kind of looks like an Adirondack lean-to, except it has a front on it and a door on it and a window. You know, these guys, you know, this part of the Adirondacks is one of the coldest areas in the east. It's very cold there, and I'm sure they needed a break to get in. And, you know, I had a wood stove, and I'm sure a big pot of coffee going in there if they needed it. So just one of the other things. This is a picture of, well, there's several mills on the right-hand side there. The log pond ran down there, and all the mills were lined up on both sides of the pond, and there was rail lines down there to feed all the mills. This one off to the left here, that was the main mill, and that was the Ford Brothers mill. In Pennsylvania, with their first mill fires, the Riches decided that they themselves didn't want to own mills or run mills. So they went back to their hometown, and there was these two brothers named Hemmon and Royal Ford, and they were pretty well known with their sawmill, and they were some of the first in the area to have bandsaw mills. So they actually worked out with them and contracted them. So, and from the second job in Pennsylvania to Wanakena and then New York, it was a partnership that worked well, and they moved along with them 3 different locations. If you go back just a second, Shawn, there's you see the men down in the foreground there, with the long poles. Those are called pike poles, and they had spikes on the end of them. And the men would guide the logs along. And if you see under the shoulder of the guy with the lighter shirt there, you can see a log going up. That was a conveyor. They would guide the logs over. The conveyor would grab it, take it up to the second floor where they would be sawed. They would be put onto the log carriage. The first floors of all the mills, that had the power, the belt drive, and the lower wheel of the bandsaw down below. Okay. That's just another shot of the main mill over there, and you can see in the background, it's a little fuzzy, but in the background, kind of off to the left center there, that was all the lumber yard where all the finished product were stacked and ready to be transported out on the railroad. Okay, this is Ryan and Schleter's Lath and Pulp Mill. They also they were in Wanakena, and they also migrated to Manchester here. I think Bill told me there's some descendants here from that family. One of those families.
Dick Schleter, who's still here.
Yep, that's right. Okay. This next one's hard to see the mill with all the steam and piles, thousands of logs all around. But that was the veneer mill right there. And you can see there's a railroad track there. It kind of feeds into it too. Okay. And this is some of the guys that worked in the veneer mill. I don't know if it's all of them, but there was a couple of teenage boys there too. Now, I don't know if they were working there, if they just came over to pose with their fathers in the picture, but it's interesting how everybody's got a hat on. It's kind of funny. This was a suspension bridge. The village was the town center, and all the residences were on the north side of the Oswegatchie River. The mill complex was on the south side of the Oswegatchie River. And the only way they originally at first had to get over there was they did build a railroad bridge around the end so they could service the mills, but it was a long walk and kind of a pain to go up over there. So they built this suspension bridge with a tower on each side, really heavy cables. The cables, I think they're about 1.5 inches around, and that held that bridge up. It was 171 feet across there. And that bridge lasted for over 100 years. It was really sad. In 2014, there was a huge ice jam that came down the Oswegatchie River, and it took out the middle third section. But the townspeople really wanted to rebuild it, and they raised for independent donations $130,000, and they got some grants, and they raised $250,000 and rebuilt the bridge. This is a picture I took myself in 2007 of the original bridge. Okay. And, you know, that's another, I didn't take this one, but it's just a nice picture of the bridge. The riches, that village, it mentions it on the other card, but that village there, it had electric lights and running water and a lot of amenities that a lot of the little towns, villages didn't have any Adirondacks yet. Rich had a steam generating plant over by one of the mills. They also tapped into a large spring, which still feeds the town today. They put underground piping in, they put sewer in. They had telephones between the residences and the store. So it was, you know, it was as modern as they could make it, considering where it was in the wilderness. Okay. That's just a quick aerial photo of the village kind of as it looks today. That little, right in the center there is the town center. You can see the footbridge coming across the Oswegatchie there, that white line. Down at the very bottom, you see that kidney-shaped pool of water. That's actually it goes much bigger out of the photograph. That was the mill pond. And right where the little point is on the right, that's where the Ford Brothers mill was. And then the mills were lined up both sides all the way down. To the right, that cleared area is where the where the finished product, where the logs are, where all the sawing was completed and ready to load onto the trains. One thing Rich did, he was one of the very first to do it, is they piped steam into the log pond in the wintertime because it got so cold the pond would freeze. So they pumped steam into the pond, kept the pond thawed so they could use it all the time. Okay, getting toward the end here. There's two great things that Rich did before leaving Wanakena. One was that he had a good partnership with the Adirondack Guides, and there was a couple really famous ones that worked out of Wanakena, and people would come and stay at the hotel, hunters and fishermen a lot of times, and the guides would make money by guiding them and charging a fee and tips and things. But it was also good for Rich because they came there to do that, so they stayed at Rich's hotel. So a couple of the guides approached Herbert Rich and said, "You've got all these cutover lands. Could you please do us one favor? Could you please leave some trees on some of the bends on the Oswegatchie River? Because, you know, the trout do so well in deep, cool water, and these trees shade the water and keeps the water cool." So Herbert Rich, he had a little empathy for the guides, but he also, being the businessman, he knew one hand washed the other, you know, it was good for both. So he agreed to it. And today, if you paddle with a kayak or canoe up the Oswegatchie River, you'll see some mammoth trees on a few of the bends, and it's because of Rich Lumber Company leaving them, where everything else was cut off bare around there. This picture here is a picture of the beginning of the forestry school in Wanakena. The gentleman that was in the center of the picture that I showed early on, Otto Hamley, he loved Wanakena. He told Herbert Rich he was going to stay with Wanakena, and he became a very important, prominent member of the community. And years later, he was tasked at actually disposing of all Rich's land. He sold off camps and land plots and all the different things. When they moved to Manchester, him and his wife also bought the company store and operated the company store up into the 50s. But he came to Herbert and he said, we have all these cutover lands. This would be a great place to start a forestry school, something to manage the land, to replant, to teach environmental things. And Herbert really, he didn't have to do it, but he could have made money selling off the land, but he donated over 1,800 acres to start the forestry school. And it's still there today. This is a shot of it. And I think in the early 70s, it has been doubled in size since this. This isn't a very good picture, but if you go to the next picture, this is how it looks today. It's twice its size. It's on the Oswegatchie River. They've got boat launch. They've got so much stuff there. And I've been there when they're doing classes out in the woods on tree cutting, and it's been part of the Syracuse University School of Forestry almost since its conception, and it's known as the New York State Ranger School, and it's graduated, I think last count it was somewhere over 4,000 people in its history, and these people have gone on to work in all the states and around the world. So it's a pretty important thing, and it's not something that I know of any other lumber company doing, for the good of the land after it had been cleared. But anyway, that's my part, and we're on to Bill. Thank you very much.
Hey, Bob, thanks very much. And I'll just mention, I don't know if he's on here, but Joe Blair, Blair Tree Service, he's actually a graduate of the school. He said he was going to be here, but I haven't been able to look through. But Mr. Badger, we are on to Manchester, because once Rich exhausted the resources there, we know that they came to Manchester, and a big real estate deal is announced, and so important that Sarah Cleghorn made a clipping of it and put it in the Manchester Journal notes here. And I will shut up and let you take over.
Well, quickly scan that over, but like Wanakena, the Riches came in and built a whole operation kind of from beginning to end. They built a company town. They bought the Walker farm to build their settlement and their mills. And what they had done, there was a chunk of land which various other companies tried to harvest up in the bowl kind of south of Stratton, and it just wasn't very accessible. The earlier company had tried to cut pulp there. They built a 6-mile flume. They failed. But the Riches said, they saw the potential to it and thought they could get it. So they bought stumpage rights for what was supposed to be 12,000 acres and built a railroad. And if you know the countryside, it's steep. So they started down in Richville and climbed up Liebrook, but even with the shays, which worked well on up to a 6% grade, they needed a switchback to gain the altitude. And then once they were up on the plateau, they could run around and have their various camps and mills up there for cutting the timber. And the real, there were plenty of sawmills around. Theirs was a really good one, but the railroad was what was amazing. Okay. And just to give you a perspective, this is, I think, probably taken from just about Union Street looking south. And there's the settlement of Richville on the little plateau. If you drive along there now, along Richville Road, you pass through the open fields and stuff, and then cut up onto the plateau, and there's Richville. This will give you a view. Again, you can look in the distance and see Manchester Village. And then down in the front is the settlement of Richville. And then over on the right is the mill. And the line cutting kind of diagonally through a bit is the Rutland Railroad. Can anyone see Shawn's cursor, or do you want to use the red one?
I have no trouble seeing it.
Okay. Again, another view of Richville from across the valley, the houses on the right and the mill on the left. And the square building with the flat roof is the company store. There's the company store. And like Wanakena, they kind of stocked whatever they thought people would need, even though town was closer. This wasn't in the middle of the wilderness, but you know, they wanted like to control everything. Another shot of the mill. And the funny building on the left was Ryan and Schleter's, whatever they were doing there, whether it was chipping or lath. This is a view from looking down at the backside of the mill and the mill pond and where the logs were picked up and drawn up in that kind of covered diagonal thing drawn into the mill. The company houses, these were the officers' houses. They were a little fancy on the west side of Richville Road, and they're still there today. Yep. And on the other side of the road, in where the employee houses, and the building on the left is the only one that didn't survive. It was the bunkhouse and it burned, but the other houses are still there. I think that's Kim Rizzio's house right in front of us.
Yes, it is. So
interesting thing about these houses is I was doing a little bit of work in one of them. They weren't built like we're used to seeing houses. They're no studs. And someone said it's the typical construction of houses in Pennsylvania, in the coal mine area and stuff like that. It was almost as if they turned pallets up on their side and put boards on the inside and outside. And if you wallpapered it, it kept the wind from blowing through. So they were kind of quickly built, but they've certainly survived well.
yeah, and I'll just add right here, this large square building where you can see the store that we saw earlier, and this is the line. There's the Rutland Railroad, actually the spur leading into the mill. There's the large boarding house that burned down. I think it burned down in the 1930s, and that's the Rizzio house, which is still in the Rizzio family. And then this was the office, and this office building was kind of painted a dark, you know, it was a blue that you couldn't miss. When you drove down Richville Road, you'd see it over there off the side. And they tore it down earlier this spring and kind of revealed this large chunk of concrete there, which kind of led people wondering what it was. And it was actually the foundation for the safe. And, you know, because the safe was up on the second floor, and obviously it was heavy enough where they wanted to make sure nobody could you know, get to it from underneath, and certainly so it wouldn't go through the floor.
Bill, we have a question in the chat. Were those Sears and Roebuck kit houses?
No.
Oh, no.
No, they were built by the company using the technique that apparently a lot of, it probably picked it up in Pennsylvania. A lot of the coal mine towns were built with. It was a top plate and a bottom plate and boards in between and no studs.
If you go to Wanakena, you'll see the same type of construction that they did. Yep.
Another shot of the mill, and there's a boxcar in there at Ryan and Schleter's operation. Now we get a little sidetracked in this next series. It's trains, you know, it's me. So here's a shot of Richville with fairly new, looks like the houses are still under construction, and the train, southbound Rutland train, out on the main line. Okay, well, that's fine, it's just train. And then the next shot, well, I'm sorry, it's not very good quality. There's the rear end of the train is still out on the main line, but there's smoke coming up from the middle of the picture. Well, what's that about? Is that the mill? I was trying to figure that one out. But the next picture, well, there's the end of the train out on the main line. And there's the smoke. So the southbound train had dropped their train and backed into the siding to either pick up a car or drop off some cars at the lumberyard, and then would head back out again. So there's kind of a little story there you can figure out from a series of pictures. And here's another picture of number 6. This was, you saw pictures of it at Wanakena. And it looks like they seem to have one flat car behind. They didn't use flat cars for logging. So they were probably doing some sort of maintenance on the line. These guys were out there working on track. This picture has often been credited, even in books, to the Manchester, Dorset, and Granville. But I couldn't figure out where it was on the Manchester, Dorset, and Granville until I started to look at it here and said, oh, there's Richville in the background. Because the caption just says the first trestle on the new railroad without being very specific. So this was the first trestle. I think it's about where the parking area is now if you park to walk up the trail, up to the falls. And what was interesting about this one is it was sawn timbers, where everything else was up the mountain was all just round stuff they found and hewed one's face flat. So I think this was probably timber they brought from Wanakena. It was close to the bottom. They could bring it, they could use it for the first trestle. And then from there on, they just made do with whatever they could find. Here's one of the further up. This is the big trestle. And here they are laying track up on the mountain. And you see, they just took a log and hewed one face flat and nailed it down. This was a logging railroad. This was not meant to be permanent. This was meant to last just long enough to get the logs out. And in a lot of cases, they would lay this track in, cut the logs, pull the track up, lay it down to somewhere else. So it wasn't expected to last long. And we talked before about the switchback trying to gain altitude. This is the lower end of the switchback.
And I was just going to say, just to give people an idea of where this is located, if you've hiked up to Liebrook Falls, and if you're up at the falls, this would be down at the bottom of the falls, and perhaps a little further south. But if you were to go up the switchback, eventually it crosses right in front of the falls.
Yep. And they must have used a lot of sand, because railroads are just steel on steel. There's no rubber traction here, and icy rails. And I suspect leaves in the fall were also a problem. It was quite the climb. This is up the switchback, about halfway up the middle leg. And you can see in the distance, that's the upper leg, the switchback going on. And we're not sure who this guy was, but he was, I think, involved in
the switchback going up this way.
The switchback back there. And it looks like a crew up there working on stuff. And this guy is just kind of inspecting, see what's going on. And here's some of the camps. And like Wanakena, they built log camps up in the woods. And this is where the men stayed. And they didn't ride down and come back every day. There was no commute involved. You went up there and you stayed and worked the woods.
Conroy's camp at Bourne Pond.
There's Bourne Pond. The tracks obviously in the lower right. There's a slightly different view of the same thing. Logs ready to. I'm not sure why they brought the boards up. They were maybe helping build another camp or something, but they obviously brought the boards up the hill because there was no sawmill up the mountain. But these are all logs ready to roll back down.
They used some of the boards for shimming, Bill, underneath some of the ties.
Because it was so quickly thrown together. Yeah.
They had a jack go along, and they could turn the jack and lift the track and shim it.
Winter was, I guess, as Bob said, in winter was the time for logging, because you could, things slid on snow and ice, so you could get a lot done in the winter. They were using horses to bring the logs down to the railhead.
Yeah, and Dr. Treat, I guess now a lot of people will know Dr. Treat's son, but Edwin Treat used to go up ride up on the shay and go up and take care of the horses. And Bob actually wrote a book, and he wrote quite a piece about, he remembers his dad talking about going up and taking care of all the horses up at the lumber camps.
And here's non-winter, but it looks like, my guess is they piled a lot of these logs in the winter to be brought down. But you can get an idea how they just laid the tracks down. It was nothing fancy. And that was why they used the Shay locomotives, because the Shay, the design of it was very flexible and could go over uneven track very slowly. If you tried to put a regular rod locomotive up here, it'd probably derail everywhere it could. But the Shays were very good at this. And this is Tom and Jim. We're not sure who Tom and Jim were, but you notice there's no chainsaw involved. This is crosscut saws. And these were the cribbing they built up to be able to roll the logs up onto the flat cars, or to the bunk cars. And a couple of guys looking at the pile going, we got to move all this stuff. This was hard, dangerous work. And they weren't, but, it was.
Bill, let me ask a question here. How did they keep the horses from being overrun from the heavy log load while coming down the mountain? Were there breaks?
They didn't come down the mountain with them. See, they were up on the flat plateau. And they loaded them on the train, and the train brought them down the mountain.
Okay.
Now the pile of logs. And this one I love. This is just, and I think Bob said this was about the end of the line. Didn't go a little further.
Yeah.
But you go to look at that pile and you go, okay, guys, we got to move this, and don't pull the key log out, because. But here's another. Looking right where Shawn is looking at it now. They came to a stream, so they just threw some cribbing up and put the tracks across. There was nothing fancy about this, which is one of the reasons I think when I've gone back later and walked up there, when they've cut roads for trucks later on, my first reaction was, well, why didn't they just go on the railroad bed? Because I'm assuming these bridges and stuff rotted out pretty quickly. So you weren't going to take a heavy log truck across something that had been there for 20 years or 30 years and was rotten. So when they were using trucks, they made their own roads. And this is at the big trestle. They're pushing 7 cars back up the hill. And then feeding the cars into the log landing. And loading where they would load one level, then they would put another two logs down and load the upper level and keep working up. You can see they chain the first lower level on, then they seem to just pile the logs on top of that. Again, loading the cars. Bob talked about the Barnhart loader that they used in Wanakena, but Wanakena was flat, so it didn't moving it around didn't change really what they could carry. Manchester was very steep, so they didn't use the Barnhart here because it would have cut down what the number of empty cars they could take back up the mountain if they were taking this heavy steam loader up with them every trip. This is a little bit of a mystery, but everything is in focus except the cars. So I think what they were doing, they loaded the cars. This is the 7 cars that were brought up. They loaded the cars and then were probably released the brakes and let them roll downhill.
Yeah, and this next picture is one of my favorite pictures. Terry Tyler actually had a copy of this. This was the photo that Daley Rizzio carried in his wallet his whole life. he had gotten when he was a young man, and you could see he was probably taking, riding on one of those cars. Probably somebody stuck their arm out. Probably didn't have a selfie stick when they did it, stuck it out and took a picture going down the mountain. But Daley was born in Wanakena. Those Bob mentioned earlier, and then came here to Manchester and bought the house, and his granddaughter still lives in that house, and and his grandson still tromps around probably on the same roads that he worked when he was a kid. It's a pretty fabulous story.
These trains moved very slowly. The Shays were a slow speed locomotive, and you didn't want to go very fast. This track was not the main line. So he may well have just stepped off, taken a picture, and climbed back on. Another one of the trestles. This is the top end of the switchback, and the train's coming down. It's a loaded train. It's coming down, and then another one with a summer without the snow on the ground. And that's what it looks like today. It's, if you go up there, you can see where the railroad cut up through there, and they worked away at the ledge. And on the lower side, they're really quite nice stone walls that they built up to build this thing.
Yeah, Bob provided these pictures. If you're hiking up to Lye Brook, just before you get to where the waterfall trail is, and it peels off to the left, and you could go, further up towards Bourne Pond. But when you're walking up that section, if you look up on the hill, you'll see all the stonework that, way up on the rise. And, and you'll be like, wow, is that natural, or is that built? Who would build a stone wall up there? And it was all the retainings for the switchback. So next time, if anybody's up, hiking up to Lye Brook Falls, just before you get to where the trail splits, you go right to the falls to the left. If you want to keep going, just keep an eye on that ridge above your head, because that's where the tracks were. And as you're doing that last stretch, walking towards the waterfalls, you're actually walking on the switchback. And if you pay attention and look towards the bank side, not the steep side, you'll actually see railroad ties still in the ground. It's amazing that, over 110 years later that, they're still, I remember seeing that. It was like, that's kind of random before I had any idea, but, you can see the railroad ties still there.
Well, and especially since they were not creosote treated. They were just plain old logs thrown down.
And when you look up, that's the type of stonework you'll see up on the hill. And thank you, Bob, for climbing up there and actually taking a picture, because that's not an easy climb. I know that from experience.
This is one of my favorite pictures. The train has come down the upper leg on our right and is starting down the middle leg of the switchback. And the Rich company realized way back in Wanakena, maybe even in Pennsylvania, that to be safe, they needed air brakes. So the train had brakes. It wasn't just dependent on guys riding the cars and cranking a stem winder. But they had one accident. See, everywhere except in the middle leg of the switchback, the engine was in front. So if anything got away, it wasn't gonna, the engine was holding it back. But here, the engine was in front when they backed back down the switchback. And in this particular accident, which was not long after they started, some of the cars got away and the guys were riding the cars and they jumped and they were hurt and there was a lawsuit. So after that, the company rule was that on the switchback, anybody on the train had to ride in the engine. Everywhere else, you could ride on the cars if you wanted to. And they're starting back down the switchback. Sorry, it's a fuzzy picture, but it's really gives you an idea what it was like. Another trestle. That's the big trestle coming down with a load of logs.
Must have been harrowing to be in the cabin looking out,
Yeah.
knowing how carefully that trestle was built.
Yeah. And I imagine in a wind, when the wind was going, you just have to picture also that they had a trestle like this built right in front of the falls. And it makes me absolutely crazy that we don't have a picture the shade coming across the trestle with the waterfalls behind it.
Yeah.
You know, and you never know, maybe someday one will show up. So if anybody ever comes across this random picture with this beautiful waterfall and this, and you're like, where is this? It's Liebrook Falls, so give me a call.
Well, the first time I walked up there, which many years ago, there was some cribbing like you see here still in the falls. And I think that's all gone now, but it was they didn't, no fancy stonework or anything here, just threw some logs together, throw it up, get the railroad working.
Yeah, there's.
If you go up above the falls, Bill, where the railroad crossed, there is some little cribbing sticking out of that brook up above that feeds the falls.
Is it still? It's those little things you find that you say, well, it's, there's bits of history you can find. I've never seen a picture of a snowplow that they used. Now they had something, and whether they just had guys shovel or I don't know, but it seemed logical to me they would have had some sort of snowplow, but I've never seen a picture of it. Here they are up in the woods. You can see on the right the cribbing and logs up above. And down at the bottom, they tipped the track so that it was easy enough to release the logs, roll them down into the mill pond. You can see the engines leaning, everything's leaning. Here's an action shot of the logs hitting the mill pond. And here's some guy, they've unloaded the whole train except for 2 cars. And there's some guy standing down there with a pike pole in the water on a log, and there are 2 loaded cars above him. I'm not sure I would want to be there. This is a view of the mill pond looking north, and you can see the track that went from the railroad up the mountain. This was the track that connected it to the mill and the Rutland Railroad.
Yeah, down to there, and that's Mount Aeolus in the background.
And there's a little trestle there on the left, and that may be where it's crossing the brook?
That's crossing Live Brook because they turned the brook to fill the pond.
Yep. And here's kind of looking back the other way at the mill with a good supply of logs. And here's shade number 6 that looks like they've been dumping ashes from the firebox, but I'm not sure what the tie is doing there. There's the mill crew come out to, all right, guys, take a 5-minute break, get your picture taken.
And this just goes to show you, at one time in Manchester, there were probably, at least, 5 to 10 different milliner shops going at any given time. And Bonnet Street took its name because, there were hat shops all along Bonnet Street. And because it was very popular to wear hats for several generations. If I put on a top hat like that or a derby, everybody would probably make fun of me. And this picture is actually interesting because I think Terry Tyler told me that he looked at this photo with Daley Rizzio, and Daley said, there was a time when he could have named every one of those people. And I said, well, why did you tell him to write it down?
Really? And a shot inside the mill. Looks like they also did a business in kindling and lath. And this was Ryan and Schleter's operation. Nothing was wasted. They used everything. It looks like they've been gathering and cutting short edgings. And this, unfortunately, is a poor quality picture, but it's Shea number 7 in front of the company store. And that's the tracks connecting back to the Rutland Railroad.
And that's the Rizzio
Ridgeville
house
in the
up there.
background. And there's the school bus at the company store.
So originally they had a school down on Cass Terrace, And right around 1912 is when they built the Merriman School, which is right across from the post office today. And it's the tutorial center and prospect rehabilitation. And that was the last of the neighborhood schoolhouses to be built. But Rich Lumber was one of the catalysts for building that school. And this was probably obviously after 1912, because you see the kids are getting loaded up. They certainly were getting loaded up to go from one end of the neighborhood to the others. And, and I'll let Bill talk about what's interesting over here in the background, which we always like looking at these old pictures, because it's not what's the focus, it's what's going on in the background.
What's going on in the background is there, you can see the shine of the wheels. These are some flat cars that they're taking hay and other provisions up the mountain for the horses, and probably some bags of flour and who knows what else in there, but they were loading up the flat cars. So one of the trips up the mountain was going to take these cars up for the camps. This was Ryan and Schleter's operation, cutting lath. They had bundles of lath there, and were loading the Grand Trunk car. There's another operation, picture of the mill looking back at the mill. And they built these raised walkways that they could roll along two-wheeled carts with lumber and then pass it down and stack it. And there's some wooden rails for another cart for pushing lumber out.
And what's interesting is this photo was taken, this part of the walk actually walked right up and came out right behind the boarding house on Cass Terrace. So when you woke up in the morning and you lived there, you would just walk down to the north end of Cass Terrace, and there would be a boardwalk, and you could walk all the way down to the mill on this walkway.
Winter shot looking back at the mill.
And I like this because you can see it's got the cart for moving, yes, and you can see the others over here all lined up.
Yeah, there's another cart there with the boards. There are a number of carts lined up. You can see the boards at angles because they're on the two-wheeled carts. This is a sort of a four-wheeled cart. I assume they just took it here and threw it off and said, okay, you guys stack it. But that's one of the four-wheeled carts that went on wooden rails.
I wonder if they got slivers.
Thousands.
And it was looking back at Richville in the background, in Equinox, and stacking lumber.
Yeah, and this is the boarding house that burned down, and then you can look across the street, and I think I believe that the owner of this current house is actually probably on our call tonight, or on our presentation.
And up the mountain, you would have had to lug your camera, and it was a process. But I think there were a lot of pictures of down here because it was convenient. So everybody with a camera could take pictures. You keep turning up. This was sort of interesting because they were here's how they were loading cars to ship it out. And Rutland sent an engine in to retrieve a car.
And then, so when they originally set up the Rich Lumber operations, I think they said it was going to last for 20 or 25 years. And so, they came here in 1912, the railroad was put in 1914, and, within the next 6 or 7 years, they pretty well depleted the resources.
And that was the surprise, that whether someone had grossly underestimated. I think when they said they were all through, they were supposed to be 12,000 acres, and it turned out to be more like 6.
And then
someone may also have guessed it wrong on the quality of the timber was there. But about 2 weeks before they were going to shut down because they were running out of timber, they had a fire. And nothing was ever, there was no, it was purely accidental. They could never prove otherwise. But it was in an opportune moment.
It's probably Grubb's grandfather is probably in that line. For real, Charles. I bet she is.
So here's these pictures were interesting. They showed up somewhat recently after the fire. And here's the main mill, the big building didn't go down, but all this stuff on the end was obviously gone.
After the fire. And this is always interesting because, we will get, within the Historical Society collection, we will get, these random snapshots and people, won't know where they are. And then, of course, someone like me will see this and get all extremely excited and fire it off to Bill and he'll know exactly what it is. It's like, oh, this is the 1919 fire at Rich Lumber. And that really did, that pretty much ended, the operations, the Rich Lumber operations. And, but a lot of them stayed, a lot of the workers stayed, some of them moved on, but obviously Richville, obviously Richville Road, it wasn't Richville Road before Rich Lumber came here. It was known as the Arlington Road or the Lower Valley Road. I see, any number of different names on the maps, but, the legacy still remains to this day.
So the mill burned. The lumber was gone, so there was no reason to rebuild. They sold both their locomotives, and basically the show was over. But as Shawn has hinted, it wasn't completely over because some of the people involved said, it's a good location, and there's still plenty of timber around. So Cass came in. A number of people that had been involved with Rich, got Cass. It was
Cass Toy Company, the TD Cass, or the ND Cass Toy Company, excuse me.
Toy Company, and they made hardwood toys. Now, Rich had cut softwood, but Cass came in on the site, and you can see in the background on the right-hand side, that was the old Rich building that survived, and they re-sided it, and then they built new buildings, and went in the operation of cutting hardwood. And a big discussion we've all had is, well, where did they get the wood? They didn't use the railroad. They weren't railroad loggers. But apparently they took stumpage rights on another piece of land and were cutting hardwood. And here you can see in the foreground is the track, but they've just piled logs on it. They're not using it. The rails were still in, but it was left over from Rich. But there's the back end of what had been Rich's mill and is now Cass. But Cass burned also, and they didn't rebuild. And meanwhile, up on the mountain, they had pulled the rails. The trestles remained, probably safe to walk on them, but not much else at this point. The forest started to grow back. Sunday, adventurers came along and played in the mill pond. Somebody's showing he knows how to ride a log. And on the right, if you look over a little more, there's a guy standing in the mill, down below between those two guys. Yep, right there.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there he is.
The mill pond wasn't very deep, which it didn't need to be. You just need to float logs. And you can see the brush starting to grow up on the where they rolled the logs down. But I don't know whether this was an organized picnic or it was just a nice day and people showed up there. And the woods started to grow back.
So this is a photo by Herbert Condon, who took a series of lantern photos. He walked the length of the Long Trail several times, and this is Lyman Burnham actually. And I think this was about 1928 or so. I meant to actually go get the exact date of it and where it was taken, but this was walking along the old railroad bed. And you can actually, if you go to the Center of Digital Initiatives, you can actually look up all these photographs. It's hundreds of photos of the Long Trail that he took in the 1920s. And you know, in the Cass fire was in 1924. So you figure that Rich started in 1912, 1914, lasted until 1919. You know, Cass came in, had the toy operation, and then, you know, they started running low, and when you know it, another fire in 1924, and that was the end of it. And nobody else built again, you know, on that property in the intervening years. I think they had the Green Mountain Mushroom Factory was there for a little while. But obviously, with the exception of the boarding house and now the, you know, the office, you know, everything is pretty much as it was, you know, as it was built in 1912.
So you're right. It's 10 years, and then everything was gone, but the legacy stayed on.
Yeah. So, well, Gloria, we managed to get through, and I think that I see that the chat is lit up here a little bit.
Yes, we've got quite a number of questions. So first of all, I want to thank you. This was a really interesting presentation. And we're going to try to get through a good number of these questions. I know we said that this program ends at 7, and if for some reason you need to leave, feel free to do that. But Shawn and Bill and Bob have agreed to stay on a little bit longer, so I hope you'll stay with us. Let's see, questions here. First of all, Ruth says, and this I guess is directed to Bob, her late husband, Charlie Stewart, graduated from the New York State Ranger School in Wanakena in '61. Although she visited him while he was in school, she has no recollection of the town that remains. She remembers the school, so sorry he was not alive to appreciate this great compilation of history. And yes, we contributed to the rebuild of the bridge. Is the hotel still standing?
Oh, the hotel burned in the, I believe it was late 50s. It operated up through the 50s, but it had a fire. The only thing that's actually, there's a residence that's built on part of the lot where the hotel was today. But if you go there, there's a big set of concrete steps out in the middle of this man's yard. We built the house, and those were the front steps to the hotel. But no, the hotel is no longer there.
So I think this is in reference to the overhead photos of the homes on Richville Road, and the train that was the Rutland train. Do you know how those overhead photos were taken? Anyone?
Early steam-powered drone.
Believe it or not, yeah, those overview shots, those were actually just taken from East Mountain. So you have to remember there was it was a logging operation, so all the trees right along the railroad line were cut down, and you know, you could see, I mean, and there was no obviously Route 7 going through there either, the new Route 7. So they were just literally taken from probably the back of the train. And you know, I would love, when I've come down the mountain, sometimes I've tried to imagine, you know, getting those shots, but of course there's all these trees in the way.
Yeah. Well, I think some from the other side were probably taken from Hildene. Looking from.
Oh, you mean the ones looking back towards, if your back was the equinox? Those would have been probably taken. Yeah, actually, they would have been taken probably from like basically Aquanic.
Yeah, I was going to say way back on the Aquanic, on that ridge hill there, when there was no trees, there was a clear shot.
Right along the long 7th, there's a big ridge, and you can look, and today you can stand there and you can look right over and see Cass Terrace through the trees.
Okay. How were the train cars moved from Wanakena?
Well, the log cars, I know that they were all, you know, they were hooked onto a railroad and they were moved. You know, they had to go down. They would have had to go to New York Central and then south and back around. And I'm not sure Bill might maps with the connections how they may have done it, what the shortest route was, but they were all towed. The question I have, and I've never seen a picture and I've never been told how, is I'm not sure how they moved those Shea locomotives. I don't know if they could have been towed, if they could have been put in a neutral position or something. I don't know. But if they were loaded, I would think it would take a crane to load them. So I'm not sure how they move, because they had a top speed when they were empty. They might hit 15 miles an hour. Their usual operation speed was like 6 to 10 miles an hour at the most. So,
and this is kind of an interesting question, because they may have intentionally selected you wouldn't want to take those bunk cars, even though they had air brakes. You wouldn't want to take them out on the New York Central main line. But they may have gone up and come across the Rutland, across the Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain as a slower route. There are no pictures of it.
Yep. And I've never read any account of how they got it there. Next time I'm over Wanakena Historical, I gotta ask them if they know. That's something I don't know.
I mean, they were always loading stuff on, narrow gauge engines and streetcars and stuff on flat cars. So they may well have put the engines on flat cars and moved them, or maybe you could disconnect the trucks from everything else and just tow them. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Keep looking for pictures.
Okay. So is the mill pond on Richville Road?
So the mill pond is basically, it would be behind Cass Terrace. So the property where the mill actually stood is private property. There's residents out there. So just as if you come in south down Richville, and before you go up the hill, on the left-hand side, you'll see a large cinder block building, which is across from the old office building. I saw somebody asked about the office, the building across the street. It is still there. Obviously the store was removed, but a building was put up in its place. And so if you were to go out, I'm guessing probably, 100 yards or so, that's where the mill pond is gone. I mean, we've looked at it on LiDAR and looked at it, from the satellite views. And I know people who've gone out there and stomped around, and you can't see any remnants. It's probably flooded there a couple dozen times at least. So there's no remnants of that log pond there. And like I said, it wasn't a pond in the sense that, it was a big, it was deep. It was just, it was built for for necessity. And I'm sure once it was, undammed, it just went away.
There's a remains of another pond up further on the other side of Route 7. I don't know what that one was for. If that was...
That's a story yet to be revealed, Bob.
Yeah, it is. It is.
They also built the highway through that mess. So,
yeah, but the pond remains.
Were the Richville settlement homes built with lumber from the mills?
Bob may know the answer to that. I think it was built from stuff that came from Wanakena.
Yeah, Cass Terrace, a lot of lumber was shipped by rail from Wanakena to build those houses, just like they shipped a lot from Pennsylvania to build, in Wanakena. They had to have material ahead of time because it took a while for the mill to be set up. I think it took them almost 2 years before the mill was operational in Wanakena when they first moved there. So, yeah, it was. I heard a number at one time how many rail cars there were that they shipped over here, but I don't recall.
It was a timing issue that they needed buildings built before, and they needed a sawmill built before the sawmill was working. So they had to bring stuff in.
They needed places for their employees to live too, and and so that was the first job they had to get done.
Are there any photos of the Rich family?
I have a photo of Claude Rich.
Yeah. Secretary.
Claude stayed here. He lived on Cass Terrace. He ended up working in Bennington. And I should have read up on this before I got on this, so that way I would know just in case anybody asked. But I know who asked the question, and I can certainly let you know about that. Maybe I'll put together a post later, Caitlin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was the secretary for him, Claude.
Were the workers local to Manchester or people who migrated to Manchester for the work?
John, you want to address that?
Yeah, so the answer is yes to both. There were a lot of locals. We do know that, there was certainly, a lot of immigrants came, a lot of Italians, a lot of French Canadians. just like we saw with the marble industry, I mean, they went where the work was. You know, for instance, you know, I know I've already name dropped Rizzio a couple times just because obviously there's somebody that, you know, that I know on a personal level. And it was actually Kim's great grandfather came here and actually worked for Manchester Lumber. We have pictures of him on the, you know, where RK Miles is now when it was Manchester Lumber before, you know, which, you know, predates Manchester Lumber, you know, of him working there. And then he obviously went back out to Wanakena and then came back again, you know, with Rich. And then obviously, you know, one of his sons stayed. And, you know, had you know, had a son and, you know, and so on. A lot of people, they came, you know, a lot of people, they left. And, you know, it just.
Well, Shawn,
yeah.
another connection is Ryan and Schleter had their, you know, operation working for the Riches. And when the mill was gone, they had to do something. So they had a lumber yard and a coal business in Manchester Depot alongside the track. And in 1940, Dick Miles took over Ryan and Schleter.
Right.
So, and Dick Schleter, you know, another generation or two down, was the retired state electrical inspector.
Yeah.
So
and I know his daughter Carmen. One day I was like, wait a minute, your maiden name is Schleter? We need to talk.
The actual Rich employees, a lot of them migrated here with them. They worked for the railroad for Rich's part, what he actually owned.
Okay. Are the mill wheels still around, the stone wheel?
They didn't mill, a stone mill wheel was for grinding grain.
Yeah, I remember there was a picture. When and I think it was probably because there was a bandsaw. So I think that I know the picture the person's thinking of when they saw it. It was just one of the wheels from the bandsaw. It wasn't a.
Yeah, I think some of those were covered too. So you may be looking at a metal cover from a bandsaw.
Yeah, after it's gone through a fire.
Yes.
And do you have any pictures of cast toys?
I do. You know what? I actually have 3 cast toys in the collection that Herbie Westner tracked down, and I'm embarrassed to say that I did take a picture of one. So for those of you who are on social media, I will redeem myself and I will post some pictures of the cat. I have a picture. It's a little truck. I have a number of catalogs, and you know, this is another one of those things where I said, well, do I put a picture of the cat? You know, do I put some scans of the catalog in and show pictures? And this is a case where we could be here till midnight if I really wanted to put absolutely everything in. But yes, we have catalogs and photos.
This was a speedy version of what we can talk about.
You can go online. If you go online and look up Cast Toy Company, they were in business for a long time. They were headquartered in Athol, Mass. And you can find a lot of pictures of their toys online. There's even some for sale on eBay. People trade and sell. So yeah. They made all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, we have like a little wooden truck with the dumps, and then there's like a, you know, it's like a little table and a little broom, and I mean, it was all kind of, you know, it was really neat. The little doll tables, and you know, really charming things. You know, stuff that Bill used to play with.
Well, no, right, Bill.
So, and we had one question here. Where is Cass Terrace? Could you?
So Cass Terrace is on Richville Road. If you're familiar with Manchester, where the Manchester Center Post Office is, that's on Richville Road. If you were to continue down, what would you say, another mile and a half or so, Bill?
Maybe.
Bob? Maybe.
Mile and a half.
And you'll go up a rise, and you know, there'll be houses on the left and houses on the right, and it's just literally like a little village. And then you go down the hill, and then there's nothing once again.
It's right past that big block of cement on the right.
If you Google it, you know, you'll get directions. You get directions to it. And it's still Cass Terrace. I mean, that's the name of the road, actually. So.
Okay, I just see some comments about thanking you and great presentation. Just love the presentation, fabulous. So I think we're
Actually, I have one. There's one that I have to read from.
okay.
For Bill from Herb Ogden asking what sort of snowplows did they use on the railroad.
Okay.
Tell Herb he needs to find the picture. I mean, we can guess that they might have had a V on the end of a flat car or something, but I've never seen a picture of one. We'll have to start looking in all these photos in the background. They had a little machine shop, kind of up north of which I've also never seen a picture of, north of the mill, and they may have kept stuff up there.
Okay, it looks like that's it for questions. So not bad, 5 minutes after 7. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I just love, I love this collaboration we have with you. I want to thank you, Shawn, Bill, and Bob. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks, Gloria.